Dylan serves as senior planner at the New York City Department of City Planning. In this role, he manages citywide zoning changes and advises the City Planning Commission on land use policy. His areas of focus include hazard mitigation, climate adaptation, distributed energy and production and battery storage, urban agriculture, industrial policy, and economic development. Following Hurricane Sandy, Mr. Sandler served as the project manager of Resilient Industry Study, an initiative to help industrial businesses recover from damage caused by Hurricane Sandy and reduce risk during future events. He also serves as the agency's liaison to the city's Hazard Mitigation Plan. Previously, Mr. Sandler worked as a consultant supporting the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration to implement their National Climate Action Plan and the National Ocean Policy. In this role, Mr. Sandler facilitated communication and policy development across federal agencies focused on coastal planning and climate mitigation and adaptation. Mr. Sandler also served as, and there's a bunch of other stuff he did, interspersed between the paragraphs that I'm reading from. Mr. Sandler also served as a research associate at the Center for Studying Natural Hazards and Disasters, located at UNC Chapel Hill, now known as the Natural Hazards Resilience Center, where he conducted applied research regarding hazard mitigation, sea level rise adaptation, and disaster recovery planning, and helped maintain the center's website and social media. And he also helped very directly to save my sanity while he was working as my right-hand man. So Mr. Sandler has direct experience with hazard mitigation planning at the local and state level. Working with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management, he reviewed local plans for state and federal compliance, authored a chapter on climate change for the North Carolina State Hazard Mitigation Plan, and helped compile materials used in training sessions for hazard mitigation planners. He is a published author of the second edition of the textbook, Hazard Mitigation and Preparedness, and an introductory text for emergency management and planning professionals. Key topics addressed include assessing risk and engagement in mitigation and preparedness activities to make communities more resilient. The third edition is forthcoming in the fall of 2021, published by Taylor and Francis Group at CRC Press. And as a little aside there, I am ostensibly Dylan's co-author on this, and he is the best co-author you could ever want. He is a tireless worker and has carried the lion's share of this third edition, which has turned out to be a bit of a bear. Dylan is a graduate of the North Carolina School of Mathematics and Science, has a BA in political science and a master's in city and regional planning from UNC Chapel Hill. So we've got another distinguished alum in our midst. We're so lucky to have, produced so many qualified planners. So I just want to say that while living in Chapel Hill, Dylan volunteered as an environmental planner for the Friends of Bowling Creek and served as vice chair of the Chapel Hill Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Board. He also raised backyard chickens, which my family adopted when he moved to Durham. And as I recall, they were pretty good layers until their retirement. So I'm going to let Dylan take it away and start sharing your screen.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anna. I don't think I've ever heard a bio of me that included how well my chickens laid eggs, but that did feel like a significant part of my, my career, and so I appreciate that.
Absolutely, they were very pretty chickens.
They were. Thank you. I guess, but maybe before I jump into the slides, I thought it might be helpful just to give a little bit more background about me and my connection to DCRP and the Coastal Resilience Center, and Anna. I'm from North Carolina. I went to UNC undergrad 15 years ago. My first year of undergrad, I randomly took a city planning class and ended up being a research assistant on a study with Anna documenting historical uses of North Carolina's beaches, basically just trying to prove that the public had been using the beaches for a long time, and because of that, we should continue to have access to beaches. It involved a few trips to the Outer Banks, but mostly just hanging around the libraries, and have worked with Anna, continue to work with Anna for years, and a range of different sort of coastal management and hazard mitigation efforts, and then at what was the Coastal Hazard Center is now the Coastal Resilience Center, and about 6 years ago, I moved to New York. I took a job managing a study of industrial flood resiliency. So this was in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, and many of the industrial areas of the city had been hit particularly hard by the storm, but also had really gotten less attention immediately after the storm, and had kind of, these industrial businesses had really picked up the pieces as best they could on their own, and rebuilt, and further down the road, there was really an acknowledgement that there needed to be much more of a planning effort in the industrial floodplain. And so I kind of led that project, and have since continued to work in the planning agency. I continue to do some things related to flood resiliency and hazard mitigation, but also work on a range of other economic development projects, and more recently, a lot of COVID recovery and COVID economic recovery in light of what's going on. So I'm going to share some slides about resiliency work that's happening in our agency and in New York City. But also, a lot of this relates to many other planning issues. And I think that, in the questions and discussion, I think we should feel free to stray from that to broader planning questions that I think people have. So with that, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. All right.
Great.
Are you all seeing this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's see, I'll get right into it. So people often forget that New York City is very much a coastal city. We have 520 miles of shoreline, and a significant amount of development in low-lying areas, and in the floodplain. This isn't something that is new, but Hurricane Sandy made people much more aware of this. I think it was the vast majority of New Yorkers really did not realize before 2012 that there was significant flood risk in New York. So the map on the left shows the FEMA designated floodplain. And so we have about 500,000 people who live in the 100-year floodplain, another almost 350,000 who are in the X zone, the moderate risk floodplain. So this is, these are this is like the equivalent of Minneapolis's population living in the floodplain of New York. Really massive, massive amount of people and buildings and infrastructure that are vulnerable to flooding. The map in the center shows the Sandy inundation area. At this scale, it doesn't look all that different, but it is in most cases was larger than the 100-year floodplain. And one of the things that's, I think, interesting and notable about this is that had the storm hit at a different time, if it came 6 hours earlier or 6 hours later, this map would look very different. So we would have seen much more flooding in the Bronx and northern Manhattan, and much less flooding in places like Red Hook and parts of Staten Island and Brooklyn, where we saw a lot of damage. And then on the right, we have the expected floodplain in the 2050s. So this is taking into account sea level rise projections. And when we look at this, what stands out to us is that it actually looks very similar to the FEMA 500-year floodplain. And so that has been important for us because we have we have decided to use the 500-year floodplain as a proxy for what we think the high-risk area will be in just a few decades. So as I'll talk about in these slides, we are, even though the National Flood Insurance Program and many of the building code regulations that relate to the National Flood Insurance Program are tied to the 100-year floodplain, from a planning perspective and a zoning perspective, we are much more interested in the 500-year floodplain. So we tend to think about resiliency through this multi-tiered approach. So, we have, in some areas, we are building coastal defenses. We are elevating berms and parks on the shoreline. More often than not, we are getting funding. We are designing and planning for these things. Funding often relies on federal and federal partners and state partners. So there are definitely limits to how much the city can do in implementing these kinds of things. And even, we are very aware that with a 520-mile shoreline, we can't armor the whole coastline. And even if we could, that wouldn't necessarily be a good idea from a resiliency standpoint, because there are many different kinds of hazards that the city faces. And so, we could build a 20-foot berm around the city, and then if we get 10 inches of rainfall in a few hours, we basically built a bathtub for ourselves. So I think that we also need to be thinking about what's landward of the shore. In the planning department, we mostly focus on the building scale, buildings and neighborhoods. So how do we develop the appropriate densities based on the risk, and how do we allow appropriate uses based on the risk? And I think more than that, how do we encourage buildings that are designed to withstand or really designed to mitigate risk and able to withstand changes into the future. There are also many investments that are going on related to the city's infrastructure, significantly improvements to the city's subway system and electrical grid. Those are, while very important, not something that a planning agency deals with a huge amount. And then ultimately, we're a city of people and businesses, and there are a lot of efforts going on related to continuity of operations planning and evacuation planning, something that our agency touches on, but for the most part, that's more coordinated by our Office of Emergency Management and other operational agencies. So when I'm walking, I'll walk through what is basically a proposal that is underway right now to change our city's zoning to provide more flexibility and more incentives really to mitigate flood risk. So this is very timely because this is actually moving through the public review process right now. And so this is an ongoing proposal that we expect to be adopted by the City Council in the coming months. I probably should have said at the outset that because this is an active proposal, all of these views are very much my own and not, I'm not speaking on behalf of our agency, but very excited to share this work that is underway. So the first goal of this proposal is really to ensure that we're not just thinking about the current floodplain and current risk, but the future floodplain. So, I mentioned at the beginning that today our provisions really apply only to the 100-year floodplain. And, this is defined by FEMA. These flood maps are updated infrequently. It's a long process to change them. And I think that as a city, we want to be sufficiently conservative in our planning efforts and make sure that we are using maps and using information that reflects the potential for greater flooding into the future. And so all of the things that I'm going to talk about in terms of different ways that people can modify the zoning or get different incentives for building in different ways. All of these, if this proposal is adopted, would apply in the 500-year floodplain, extending far beyond the 100-year floodplain and into areas that were flooded during Hurricane Sandy. So the second goal here focuses on making sure that our rules encourage buildings that aren't just protected, but are usable, that they're spaces that meet people's needs and meet businesses' needs. Because I think it became really apparent to us as we started thinking about what the rebuilding would be after Sandy, to make sure that elevating buildings and building kind of concrete walls along sidewalks is not what we want in terms of encouraging walkable spaces, attractive spaces, functional businesses. So a lot of these provisions are about really thinking through the implications for urban design and for the use of space. So one of the more significant components of this is that many of our zoning districts have height limits. And so historically, if people wanted to elevate their homes, they basically had to sacrifice square footage. They kind of had to squish their home into a new building envelope between the existing height limit and the elevated floor elevation. And so we under this proposal, we've kind of let people measure the height from the flood elevation and from the expected flood elevation rather than measuring it from grade, so that people aren't having to choose between building in a resilient way or retrofitting or having to sacrifice space. And we actually decided to go beyond that because what we realized is the space below the base flood elevation, it is allowed to be used for parking or minor storage. And what we didn't want it to be a case where people could elevate, say the floodplain is 6 feet above grade. We didn't want to allow people to elevate to 6 feet and then not be able to use that space for parking or, to have some kind of ancillary space. So if people actually want to go up, 10 feet above grade before the actual livable space begins, that is now allowed. For ground floor commercial space, it is really important to us that streets are, encourage active uses, and for businesses, businesses don't want customers to have to walk up, 5 or 6 steps to go window shopping, both from a economic development standpoint and also just from ADA and there are many reasons why it's important for us to have retail and commercial space at the street and at grade. So what we've done is if people build their ground floor commercial space in a way that is flood-proofed, so they are installing aquarium glass and flood panels on entrances, they can actually exempt that square footage of that space so that they can build higher, kind of replace it higher up in the building. So if you're building in New York, a mixed use building with ground floor retail and say 10 floors of residential, if they decide to make a resilient ground floor retail space, they could actually build 11 floors of residential. So this is one way that we're, not just providing flexibility, but really trying to provide incentives for these kinds of investments. And these are very significant investments. And I think that's something that we were realizing is these are without some kind of carrot. Many of these things aren't going to happen. And particularly until, flood insurance until flood insurance actually kind of makes it financially necessary to make these kinds of investments. These are things that probably wouldn't happen on their own. See if I can get it to advance. There we go. So when people do take advantage of some of these kinds of incentives, we are also requiring some kinds of streetscape improvements. So it's basically giving people like a menu of things that they can choose from, whether it's different wall treatments or having planters or different things to make sure that the design of spaces is really meeting the desires of communities. So the next set of modifications would allow building owners throughout the floodplain to make incremental improvements. And what we realized is that, New York has a massive existing building stock. Much of it we expect to be around for a long time. And many people aren't going to be able to bring their buildings fully into compliance with FEMA standards, with the National Flood Insurance Program. And so we wanted to provide ways that people could do smaller things that would still have a significant impact in terms of reducing risk. So as one example, if buildings have an HVAC system or electrical substations or elevator equipment that's in the basement or at grade and vulnerable to flooding, we wanted them to be able to raise it up to the second floor, to raise it up onto the roof of the building, or in cases like this photo, to be able to build these things in standalone buildings, sort of next to the existing structures, so that in ways that our zoning used to be much more restrictive about what you could have and as an obstruction on the roof or extending into the yard. We are now allowing much more flexibility to move this kind of electrical and mechanical equipment. Another issue that we saw is that many businesses really need space that they can use above grade. And in many cases, zoning, especially in manufacturing districts, we have a lot of zoning districts that really only allow for one floor. So these are kind of low density historic manufacturing districts that have a lot of single story warehouses built from the 1920s to 1950s. And people wanted space for storing equipment, for having a small office where they could in the event of a storm, they could relocate some valuable equipment or merchandise. And so we provided more ability to build second floor space, to build mezzanines, and all of these are exempted from the density requirements and the floor area requirements that we typically have. And along the same vein, if people want to build different retaining walls, flood panels, physical barriers, many of these can go beyond the existing bulk rules that are allowed in zoning. We also have many new options for waterfront sites. And so these allow for softer shorelines, for esplanades where water can flow beneath them. And all of this is trying to ensure that we are still promoting access to the waterfront. It's one of the city's biggest assets. And we want to make sure that if people, as people are building up and building ways, protecting their buildings, that they're not cutting people off from the waterfront. And in many cases, we'd like to see things where the waterfront is able to absorb some of the impact of storm surge and waves. And the last goal is really focused on facilitating disaster recovery and preparing for a range of hazards, not just flooding. And so while the rest of these things I've been talking about are available to buildings and property owners in the floodplain, this last goal applies to the whole city. And these are things that apply to any zoning district in the city. So backup power systems are incredibly important. not just diesel generators, but solar panels with battery storage, fuel cells, a range of backup power. And we have made sure that if people want to build these on, on the roof of a building, on a side yard, on top of a garage, that zoning is not getting in the way. And I think, this is, we are now allowing things like, if you want to build solar panels on the roof of your residential building, and have them, elevated up 8 or 10 feet so you can still have a roof deck below them, that is fine. So really trying to make sure that we're getting out of the way, allowing these kinds of innovations to happen. And there are always things that we're not going to be aware of, and there's always kind of a process of learning what people are trying to do and continuing to adapt these kinds of rules. So we also spent a lot of time thinking about how to protect vulnerable populations, and the role of land use regulations in doing this. So New York City has many nursing homes and other institutional residential facilities that are located in the floodplain. And for many of these populations, sheltering in place can be dangerous and risky, but evacuating can also be dangerous and risky. And so the new rules would not allow nursing homes to be located in the floodplain. And I think more broadly, I've been talking mostly about ways that we're incentivizing retrofitting buildings and resilient construction. But we are thinking about ways to, in certain locations, limit density in vulnerable areas. So, I mean, this is one example that applies to a specific use, but New York City over the last few years has done rezonings in very high-risk neighborhoods where we have lowered densities. So, areas where we used to allow, multifamily housing, where now we only allow 1 and 2 family housing, with the thinking that, while it's not necessarily saying we are retreating from these areas today, we don't necessarily want to foreclose that option going into the future, and some acknowledgement that there may be a necessity for buyout programs or for changes in where we make investments in infrastructure and in buildings and communities in the future. And then finally, city planning works on a very long time frame, and updating zoning is purposefully a very slow process. But in the wake of disasters, we've seen that there's often a need to make pretty quick changes or temporary changes. So we've also put in place rules that are essentially valves in the zoning resolution, so that when there's some kind of disruption, we can turn on or off different parts of zoning with an executive order pretty quickly, so that we don't have to do a major rewrite. It's kind of already in zoning and can be adjusted very quickly. So I know that's very vague, but as an example, so if you have a non-conforming use, say you have a restaurant that has been around for 50 years, but it's located in a residential district. Under the current rules, if that restaurant closed for more than 2 years, it wouldn't be allowed to reopen as a restaurant. It would have to conform with the underlying zoning and become a residential use. But say there's some impact, like a global pandemic, and for example, and the restaurant closes and is closed for 2.5 years, and we want to allow it to reopen into the future. These provisions would allow us to very quickly change those rules about non-conforming use and to kind of give a longer window for businesses to be able to reopen, acknowledging that there are some circumstances where the typical timeframes and construction timeframes and permitting in zoning just doesn't really make sense given some extenuating circumstance. So that is an additional component of this flood resiliency proposal that really extends far beyond flooding, and is something that we are planning to take advantage of right now in the wake of COVID. So those are all of my slides. So I will stop sharing my screen and am happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dylan. That was really wonderful. I really appreciated that. And just so everybody knows, well, my idea of how this goes now is that maybe I'll start off with a couple of questions that you have pre-submitted. Thank you, thank you, thank you for keep on doing that. I really appreciate, and I'm really interested in seeing how you guys react to the readings. It's been fun to read the questions that you asked. So I'll pick almost at random one to get us started, and then maybe another one that's more content oriented, because I wanted to start with a question that may have been answered already by Dylan at the beginning of his talk, but that comes from Fern about your path and planning. Fern, do you want to read that out, or do you want me to?
Sorry, I have to unmute. I don't have it in front of me. I think I have a question about kind of where you landed or how you landed where you are today, which I feel like you kind of walked out a little bit in the introduction. So I guess maybe to make it more specific, since we have some of the broad strokes already, would be to ask you if there are, I know that sometimes like the path that we walk on is determined by like random choices, but random choices aside, are there things that you intentionally did or sought out over the course of your time at DCRP or afterwards that you feel like really set you up well on your path to where you are today, or things that you wish you had done that you would recommend to seek out in terms of experiences or skills?
Yeah.
Well, Dylan, let me first say I begged him to stay at the center and continue working there, but he didn't listen to me. So go ahead, Dylan.
Well, yeah, the who knows where that path would have taken me? Probably would have been great. So yeah, I mean, maybe, I guess just to first talk a little bit about where I've ended up, because I think I kind of touched on it very quickly, but didn't go into much detail. So most of my background at at planning school, working at the Coastal Resilience Center, and afterwards was focused on hazard mitigation. That was, I'd say a lot of that was kind of chance, in that I came into UNC undergrad, I don't think I had really ever heard of city planning. I was interested in environmental issues, and my first semester of undergrad, I took a seminar with Anna and my dear sort of colleague and mentor, Dave Brower, on coastal planning. And that was also the fall that Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. And I was just really kind of, I mean, it's really like the only course that I cared about and was focused on. And it just really set the course of my, the next few years for me in terms of what I was interested in and what I was studying. And then when I moved to New York, again, I took this job that was, I'd been looking for jobs focused on the things that I happened to know about and happened to have some experience in, which were about, which were about coastal planning and recovery. But I never really worked in a planning agency, and I actually didn't have much experience in city planning. And so I took this job, and the role was, interestingly, it was housed in our office that was focused on economic and industrial policy, and it wasn't really a perspective of flood resiliency more than how do we make sure that we're supporting industrial businesses. And so that was kind of, it was a slightly new lens for me. And as my as my career has kind of progressed at city planning, a lot of my work has transitioned more to like, how do we think about planning in industrial areas and balancing job growth in areas that have historically industrial jobs, but also, may have good access to transit and desire for, new commercial loft buildings and, competition, a lot of competition for space in different parts of the city, and many of those historically industrial. So it's been kind of a roundabout path, and now, my job is, it's really all over the board. I mean, right now I'm working on a project that is trying to change zoning rules for, to allow gyms and spas and massage more permissively in the city. Sometimes I do some things related to urban agriculture and allowing sort of rooftop and indoor farming, things related to modern industrial facilities like, breweries and distilleries and life science labs. So it's kind of all over the board, the things that I work on at city planning. I'm really appreciative of that. And I think that while I absolutely love the coastal resiliency, environmental work that I have done and am involved in, it's been really good, I think, for my career to start to get some experience with just like, how does zoning work? How does planning work? And to like, yeah, to understand those, as a city planner working on these things, to kind of understand the relationship between a lot of different tensions and desires for how space is used and how land is used in the city. So I think it's kind of made me more effective in thinking about sort of climate adaptation and environmental planning to have more exposure to a broader side of what a city planning agency does. And that's something that I've been out of grad school for 10 years. And I'd really say only over the last 3 or 4 years have I gotten a lot of experience, moving zoning proposals through the process and yeah. So that's a lot of, maybe a very roundabout answer, but hopefully that is helpful.
That was helpful, thank you. And I think actually Matt dropped into the chat a question that segues well from that, which is, now that you're in NYC planning, what is it like working for the NYC planning department as a work environment?
Yeah, if you want me to repeat that, yeah, there was a question that really does play on that, is what's the New York City Planning Department like as a work environment? As far in your audio was kind of.
Yeah. I love it. It's as New York City agencies go, it's a relatively small agency. We're about 300 people, which may not sound small, but compared to many others that have 5,000 or 10,000 people, it is. It is made up of so many really dedicated, interesting, smart people, and so I've been very, very satisfied working there. It is right now. It's a very political environment all the time, and I think right now that is particularly true. And we are, it is near the end of a mayoral administration, so there's a lot of questions about what are we trying to accomplish in the next several months before our mayor, who we report to, changes, and also questions about what are we trying to tee up and for the next few years, and what do we see internally as technocrats in this field. What do we see as our priorities where we, if we have the opportunity to kind of shape an agenda for the next few years, what would that look like? So as an agency, I have really loved working there, and found it very challenging and interesting. It is I think, as any city planner probably knows, can be a slow and grueling process, and you might work on a project for a year and a half that stalls out and doesn't go anywhere. And maybe in 2 or 3 years down the road, it gets picked up and goes somewhere, and maybe it doesn't. And so it's a kind of role that takes, certainly takes some patience, and, you kind of have to roll with the punches. But I found it to be a really great work environment, and, in a place that at times we can be very busy, like right now, but also an organization that really values work-life balance. And I think, we are in New York, a place that is heavily unionized, and we, are part of a city agency union that really does try to make sure that people are, people can advocate for themselves, and that people are not overworked.
That's great. Thank you. It sounds like some people might be looking for jobs soon. You get that feeling, Dylan?
I imagine it is a difficult time, unfortunately, but
yeah,
it is such a rewarding field, and things will come along.
It is doable. Does anybody want to jump in with anything in particular? Because I do have a couple other questions that I could throw out there from y'all's. Anybody burning up? Okay. Let me ask, Viviana had a question, and it kind of falls along equity issues, which we get a lot in this class, or questions about disparities and equity. And also it kind of relates to a couple other questions. Some people asked about, well, what do renters do? They don't really have a voice in what happens to the building that they live in necessarily, unless there's a strong cooperative going on, or however. So basically, Viviana asks, want to ask? You want me to read it out?
I can have it in front of me.
Okay, I'm thinking of question 3 in particular of yours.
Okay, so here it goes. So is there a relationship between increased risk of flooding and the location of low-income communities? If so, do any programs exist to serve those who cannot afford to bring their homes or businesses up to resilient code standards through grants or subsidies?
So it's a great question. Partly the answer is that I'm probably not the best person to speak to this, just because I don't do a lot with residential policy, and I mostly work on the commercial and industrial side of things. My sense is that in terms of vulnerability to hazards in the city, there probably is a relationship. If you're looking at flooding and heat-related illness, and and also sort of health risks like air quality, there probably is a relationship between lower-income communities and communities of color, and places that experience higher risk of hazards. And there, after Sandy, there were some programs, some grants and incentives to try to help communities and to try to help businesses as well. I don't know how many of these things are kind of like, persistent, where there's kind of a consistent funding stream, as opposed to something that's more of like a storm recovery effort. So at the moment, I think that, and I could very well be wrong about this, but I think that there probably is not a source of funding to help people make these kinds of investments. I think the biggest incentive is that people can have the opportunity to lower. Sorry, I'm in New York and people are always honking. There's always the opportunity to lower one's flood insurance if you are a homeowner and you have a house that is in the floodplain and you make investments that you can lower your flood insurance. But that does not address renters, which is the vast majority of New York City. And I think that I think probably not enough is being done to address that. And also I don't know the extent of what is being done is the honest answer.
Well, thank you for that. Was that good, Vivian? Did that kind of round it out? And other people who asked about renters, which is a big concern, as Dylan points out.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, which is probably the most efficient way if you want to just jump in with something that hits you right now. So I'm going to go to, and we'll switch gears a little bit. Kristen, do you want to bring up your question/comment? Or would you like me to read it?
Which one?
Christian Snellgrove?
Oh yeah, sure. I can just read it.
Go for it.
Said granted, I'm a transportation planner, and I also know this sounds like a conservative talking point. So it's easy for me to lob criticism into land use planning when I generally don't have any say over it. I guess the idea that there's zoning laws governing specifically where certain items within buildings seems overbearing. I know I was reading one of the reports, and one of the examples was where certain electrical appliances and whatnot could be kept in buildings. I was just kind of asking in general, is it really the job of the government to be that specific about what people can do? And while I get there's definitely a need for government intervention to prevent outright irresponsibility, it just seems a little far-reaching. And I think as an example of sometimes how regulation is an active impediment, which I think was something you kind of alluded to already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of regulating things inside of a building, you're right that is typically not the realm of zoning. That's typically more of a building code and a fire code thing, making sure that buildings are sturdy, that they're safe, that people have people have access to those buildings. So I think it is very much in terms of making sure that plumbing is not going to break and flood the neighbors downstairs, making sure that your electrical circuits are installed correctly. And I don't know anything about electrical equipment, but that electrical equipment is in the appropriate place and is installed correctly. To me, that is very much in the wheelhouse of things that the government has an active role in regulating to protect health and safety. And so the way that we come into this as a planning agency is that if traditionally it made sense for a building to install a 1,000-watt substation, in New York you have a lot of large buildings and you might have 1,000-watt substation and a boiler and all of this stuff that would be historically in the basement of the building. And again, it has nothing to do with zoning. I mean, we regulate the bulk of the building, the height, the use that's allowed. But if as we learn more about flood risk, people realize like, hey, maybe there's a reason for having that substation on stilts next to the building or on the roof of the building or designed in some different way. That zoning can then be getting in the way because we say like, oh, well, on the roof of a building, we allow an antenna for cell phone towers and we allow, the bulkhead from an elevator, but we don't allow an electrical substation. And so partly what this is doing is actually saying, in ways that government, whether it's zoning or other regulations, in ways that government has created rules to keep people safe, as we need to live in a new way to accommodate storms that we're expecting to see and flooding that we're expecting to see, we want to be sufficiently flexible and not be an impediment. So I think your question is right in that we are trying to get out of the way where we can, and a lot of that takes a lot of thought to not say the way to get out of the way is to say like it's a free for all, because we still have a desire to make sure that buildings are safe and that people can, who are in a wheelchair can get into the entrance of a building, and so I think that's kind of the balancing act, is like what does this world look like when people do adapt to flooding, but that doesn't mean we let go of other goals.
Christian, how was that? That good? Got a
Yeah.
follow up? Does anybody have a follow up?
No, that was good. And then, my apologies if when I was frankly going through a lot of material quickly and I may have gotten certain specific technical questions confused. That's an apology on my part.
No,
we
it's
get your
a
point.
fantastic question.
Yeah. Good. Okay, in the chat popped up from Pierce. You have a question about property values.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties in nicely with your experience, more oriented towards commercial and industrial properties. So, any improvement on a building is going to alter its property value to a certain extent. So if a building goes through the process of retrofitting for resiliency, for flood mitigation, things like that, that's definitely going to alter its property value to a certain extent. And as like a business owner, different owners might want to increase their property value or try to keep it low in an effort to pay less taxes, whatever. So my question is there any involvement on the side of like appraisers with your zoning requirements to anticipate these changes to building value? So then the property owner can then maybe guess, okay, so if I invest this much money to change my property in this manner, I can expect my value to go up to this degree. So then I can like maybe set aside this money for taxes. I know that's a pretty complicated, intricate question, but I guess are appraisers involved at all in that process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say we, as far as I know, are not sort of directly talking with appraisers and thinking about how to craft this kind of policy. I think that maybe a step back from that. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking with building owners and with brokers to give us a sense of if we make certain kinds of changes, what are people likely to do? And so they are kind of, they have that next tier of like, what are all the calculations that go into that in terms of what tax incentives they would be taking advantage of, and what would happen to their appraisal and what would happen to their tax value. So we aren't doing that kind of financial calculation directly, but more kind of trying to be informed by the real world and not be too much in our own heads about what we think will happen without reaching out to building owners. I think another thing that made me think of that isn't really directly your question, but one of the tensions here is that there are many areas that in order to retrofitting to kind of come up to the flood resiliency construction standards, that can be a really expensive thing. And one of the tools we have, I would say, to incentivize that is to allow for redevelopment at higher densities. So you have some places of the city where, right now we might allow 2-story buildings, 4-story buildings, and we might, if we were to rezone them to allow for 8-story buildings, 10-story buildings, then it might sort of raise the value of development in that area enough to encourage redevelopment, and in doing so encourage redevelopment that then is built to the current code and built to a higher standard. But it's definitely a trade-off, because I don't know that the right approach is to encourage high density development all around the coast of New York, because you also have to think about, well, will that be resilient in 50 years, in 80 years? What about the streets and the infrastructure that go around those buildings? So I think that is a tension that we are always facing, is, you know, when do we use that kind of carrot to encourage construction where you might actually you might allow a building that is really unlikely to flood, but it also means that you're bringing a much larger population to an area that we know is going to flood. So I don't know that I have a great answer for that, but it's something that we are grappling with.
Great.
Yeah, no, thank you. I know that was kind of a pretty broad question.
Thanks, Pierce. That's great. I think we can slip in one more really quickly. And Dylan, this is not within your purview, but Rachel, if you want to ask your first question, or I can read it out about the citywide use.
Sure. Am I coming in clear enough? I know I was having trouble in some past classes. Okay, awesome. And yeah, this was just kind of from, I think, the website and just maybe some gaps you guys identified, you know, probably a few years ago, and whether you guys are tackling it now, but more at a macro level. Just like, how is the Resilient Industry Program tackling citywide risks like aging bridge and road infrastructure?
Say the last. How is aging bridge and road infrastructure?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's a fantastic question. I think we did in that study try to identify areas where businesses are facing difficulty related to flooding, and that is something that is mostly occurring through our Department of Transportation and Office of Emergency Management and kind of things that are outside of the work that we do. I think one of the big, one of the things that I have been involved in is rebuilding the tunnels that go into, I have not been rebuilding any tunnels myself, but there are a couple of tunnels that go into Penn Station. These are, built in 1910, where, Amtrak and New Jersey Transit has, brings in something like 200,000 people a day pre-COVID. And these tunnels are desperately in need of repair. And so in order to do that, really the only approach is to build 2 more tunnels and be able to close those for a number of years and sort of reinstall the concrete casing around them and reopen them. So our agency does get involved with these kind of like longer term planning efforts that where we need to be working with other neighboring jurisdictions and working with federal partners like Amtrak, and that also often involves like, well, if we're building more tracks into Penn Station, what are we doing to Penn Station, and how are we, where do we get space for adding platforms? So we have been involved in some of that kind of work, but a lot of just general kind of like state of good repair, or, just capital improvements to roads and bridges is not something that we get involved with very much, unless it's part of a broader planning effort of kind of like, a redevelopment of a larger area. Like another very quick example is they're planning to build 4 new stops along the Metro North rail line that runs from Grand Central up through the Bronx and into Connecticut. And so knowing that we have potentially 4 new rail stops coming into the Bronx in the next few years, we get involved in the planning of like, well, where should the steps land from the platform, and then what kind, are we encouraging retail space around there, and how much housing can that support? So we do those kinds of like larger planning efforts around transportation improvements, but less about the like repairing a bridge.